Welcome back to another episode of the Greek Current Cafe. I'm your host, Thanos Davelis. If you missed our inaugural episode last week, Roasting Turkey, you can catch it on our YouTube page. And so you never miss an episode, make sure to hit that subscribe button and follow the Hellenic American Leadership Council on YouTube and all of our social media. Now, for this week's major story, all the headlines this week from the BBC to the Financial Times are clear that a Parthenon Sculptures deal is quote-unquote close. Is Greece about to pull off the great heist and finally bring the sculptures home? Before we dive in, I want to do a round of intros so that you get to know who we have on our panel today. First off, Dr. Irini Stamatoudi, a professor of law at the University of Nicosia and a former member of the Ministry of Culture's Advisory Committee for the Parthenon Sculptures. Irini, it's great to have you on the Greek Current Cafe today.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure.
Next up, Niko Efstathiou, an Athens-based journalist and author who has covered this issue both from Greece and the UK with Kathimerini, and it seems one of the members of this heist, if you look at his bio. Niko, great to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Thanos, for introducing me. And I have to say, great turkey roasting last week, topical with Thanksgiving. We really enjoyed it from Athens as well.
Great. And make sure, if you haven't seen it, like we said, you can jump in and catch it on YouTube. And, last but not least, and I don't think he needs an introduction at this point, but Endy Zemenides, HALC's executive director and a regular on our show. Endy, great to have you on. And for our listeners, last week, Endy had his Olympiacos jersey on. So to balance the forces here, I've got this Panathinaikos swag.
I don't want to remind everybody that he finishes in second place, so he's wearing the second place jersey. Well, first I want to say happy namesake to Niko and all the Nikos watching and Nicoletas. And I actually hat tip to Niko because we all should be part of the Oceans. I guess we would be Oceans 14, right, Niko? As long as I get to keep the Bernie Mac character, and I will tell you the difference between hypothetical and reality later. But beyond that, before we start, I want to give a special shout out to our sponsors. Our sponsors are all of those who last week were not happy that we roasted turkey. So for all you trolls, get ready for more of that. And then second, and for some people who are not trolls and they work for a specific department in the U.S. government. Too bad.
Well, on that note, let's dive in on the Parthenon Sculptures. And Irini, we've all seen the headlines, and you've been quoted in the BBC saying that a deal is close. Having been involved in these negotiations in the past, what's different this time around? Are we on the cusp of history?
I think the topic has now become more mature, to be honest with you. I remember when we was doing negotiations a few years ago. In fact, negotiations for Greece started in 1983. I jumped it in 1999 and continued up to almost 2015. We had to do negotiations in the context of UNESCO every 2 years. There was a committee, the Intergovernmental Committee for Promoting the Return of Cultural Treasures to the Countries of Origin. I'm not kidding. This is part of the title only. It's a huge, long title. So in the context of this committee, every 2 years, Britain and Greece met and negotiated on the issue. In fact, it was only Greece that pursued the issue. Britain did not want to enter any negotiations. They were sitting on the table and they were just discussing a few words, some commas, in order for a recommendation to be issued. And this recommendation was not saying anything more apart from the fact that the parties meet in goodwill and try to find a solution to the matter. The truth was that Britain was not trying to find a solution to the matter. Now, since then, many things have changed. Cultural heritage law has developed. Many countries have done returns, have returned objects to their countries of origin, including those countries and those institutions that were against returns, especially museums, because museums have a narrative that say that we need to hold treasures for the sake of humanity, and we need to respect our audiences and things like that. At the end of the day, even the British Museum has returned to artifacts. It returned the Quake mask to the Allard Bay in Canada, and or else known as the Namgis mask in 2005. And then they returned Lewis Chessment to Scotland in 2015. And they did that on the basis of renewable loans, long-term, in fact, renewable loans. The reason why they did that as a loan was that the British Museums Act of 1963 does not allow them to return or alienate artifacts from their collections and return them to their countries of origin. So they said, we need to somehow overcome this obstacle, so we will give you a loan. And in fact, this loan would actually never be returned. However, when they proposed that to the Greek government was a bit hesitant of accepting a loan. And this is one of the thorny issues today. Now, what else have changed since then? We have a government that seems to be very, very positive towards finding a solution. I think we also need to thank for that Rishi Sunak. I remind you that when Mitsotakis went to Britain, when Rishi Sunak was the prime minister, Rishi Sunak did not accept to see him, although the meeting was already scheduled, because he was angry about an interview our prime minister had given. And that gave a lot of publicity to the matter. In fact, it also pushed Keir Starmer, that was then not government, of course, and said that if a solution is found between the British Museum and the Greek government, I won't be an obstacle to that.
And we've heard him repeat that now as well.
There was a positive reply. And then, of course, he knew he would become the next government. He knew that, in fact, by saying that, he would have to give the green light afterwards for a decision, for an agreement to go on. That was a very good addition that helped the matter. But also George Osborne is very positive. And I'm saying is very positive because we have a politician, in fact, trying to solve a matter that by that time, it was only archaeologists that were trying to solve the matter. They were the former directors of the British Museum. Archaeologists were very, very strict. They were inflexible. They wouldn't discuss. So George Osborne was a very good addition. And I just want to remind you that when Rishi Sunak said that he wouldn't meet the Prime Minister, George Osborne made a public announcement and he said, we shall find a solution irrespective of whether Rishi Sunak wants it or not, which was also very important. And then we have the new addition, which is the rather new director of the British Museum, Nicholas Callinan. He's supposed to be a person that is open-minded, a young person, and I think he also has a positive view on the matter. And of course, on the top of everything, the Greek Prime Minister has put that very high on his political agenda. He has visited on many occasions England. He has put it on the agenda of the discussions again and again with consistency. And that, of course, has helped a lot the matter. Of course, we also have to change in the press, right? We should not forget the change in the press.
I think we can jump over to the press now with Niko. Last year, Niko, around this time, you were in London just after this Rishi Sunak snub, where you reported that the return of the sculptures seemed all but inevitable. And I know we've pulled up your tweet here where you're writing, last year's scoop equal this year's reality. Now it seems your article title could be coming true. Should this come as a surprise to anyone who has been following this issue?
Yeah, I think not, for all the reasons that Dr. Stamatoudi talked about, right? So the way I see this, there was always this three-part equation concerning the return of the sculptures, right? And for years you had the British government what we say in Greek, throw the ball around to the British Museum and vice versa, right? So they were both hiding behind each other's responsibilities as to whether this would be possible. I think even before the snub of Rishi Sunak to Kyriakos Mitsotakis last year, you saw that the stars were aligning. And it's because, as Dr. Stamatoudi said, the museum itself has really changed its stance. There's a lot of pressure. And one thing I will add is that there's a lot of pressure from the donors as well. You know, we've had a generation of British people who have studied the classics. They've studied politics, philosophy, and economics in these top UK institutions, looking at Greek culture and understanding the importance of reunification for this monument. This collectively adds pressure to the museum as these donors are more and more. One other thing I'll put in the equation here, the scandal that broke last summer in the British Museum with over 2,000 antiquities being stolen. And funnily enough, we heard for years that Greece doesn't have a safe place to put these marbles and sculptures, and then you have a scandal like this sort of break in the summer, completely changing the narrative. So yeah, I think the main change we've had until last year was that the British Museum shows that it's willing to take a different direction. The change we have this year, since the article I wrote, but it was sort of imminent already, was a change in government, right? And we knew from the meetings that took place last year that, first of all, Keir Starmer, yes, he was pressured, but he clarified, I'm not going to stand in the way of a deal, like Sunak's government was signaling that it could potentially do. The other thing I know is that the chemistry between the two leaders from last year, but something that we saw repeated this year, it's actually quite good. And you want that to sort of seal the deal. Of course, it's not like the British Prime Minister would sort of sign something like this, right? But it's good to have political support as well, as opposed to someone potentially standing in the way. But the last thing I'll say is British public opinion has also dramatically shifted. And since last year, we now see most surveys showing a clear majority of Brits saying they need to go home. I think the latest survey was just released on Monday, and I see that something like 53% of Brits say that the marble should return. 23% said maybe not. Another 23 said I have no opinion on the matter. So clear majority on the public opinion front as well. So I think all of these things collectively coming together, they make it more possible for a deal. The thorn is the issue of ownership. And from my understanding of the story as I'm reporting on it, it's this exercise where legal formulation is meeting sort of branding. Like, how do we phrase this so that both sides can be happy? Can we have a case where the UK says the British Museum doesn't give away ownership, but Greece doesn't necessarily have to accept that someone else has ownership for them to be able to use it, right? So there's willingness, and when there is a will, there is a way, and I think this is where we are right now.
Endy, I know you're itching to dive in, so I want to toss the ball to you, as Niko alluded to earlier. Looking back at the many efforts to reunite the Parthenon sculptures, many of which HALC has been at the forefront of, we've seen a lot of movement on social media. We've seen a lot of shifting in public opinion, but we never really were as close as it seems we are today. While an Ocean's 11 style heist would be much more fun, I think, to talk about here, are you getting the feeling that we could see Greece and the British Museum close this deal?
I don't think we should discount Ocean's 11 heist. I mean, I think AI could do a great movie, but I think the professor Niko talked about exactly how close it is. I really have nothing to add there, but it is important to think of everything that has been overcome, because as a professor said, I don't think the British were ever genuine. They kept throwing up excuses, and every single one of those excuses has been disproven, right? Before, and we all know it, those of us who visit, when the British would say, you can't put the Parthenon sculptures in that museum that's on the Acropolis. And then you would go to the museum, on the old museum in the Acropolis, and you'd be like, yeah, you're right. But then you go to the new Acropolis Museum and you say, how can you leave it in the British Museum? It's like, it's not close. It's really not close. The museum excuse is not there anymore. And then you had one, and I'm going to cite, because again, forget, nobody was on the forefront. Greece was on the forefront of this. There are legends who have been on this forefront, both in Greece and in Britain. And I'm going to tip my hat to one of the original British who fought for this. And it's one of my favorite journalists of all time, Christopher Hitchens, who in his book about that, he said the claim of the British Museum to have been a superior curator, spurious as it was anyway in respect of stolen property, is thus it's void on its own terms. And that he wrote that years ago, decades ago, before what Niko just talked about, the artifacts going missing. So there are no excuses left. Even their citation of this law, and this is kind of, you've covered this on the podcast elsewhere. There are all these laws and there are all these legal precedents that Britain holds to that are part of its messy process of decolonization, right? The one thing that Britain was sure to do, and if you want to look at flashpoints all over the world, you want to look at what's going on in Gaza, what's going on in Syria and stuff like that, you can lay that at the feet of the British. But, okay, great, we'll come up with some legal justification, but okay, you passed a law to say stealing was okay. As we've seen with their bases, they've just lost in the International Court of Justice the last few years, rules about keeping bases and having improper colonization. And I hope one day they have to deal with their improper decolonization in Cyprus and keeping 3% of Cyprus's land territory. But this 1963 law is another bullshit excuse, and it's improper decolonization.
Irini, how do we square this circle that we've seen in these negotiations, where we have the question of ownership, we have this discussion about a loan, what could a deal look like ultimately?
That's a very good question. Well, there are three ways that could be solved. One way would be to change the law, change the British Museum Act 1963, or have a new law that in fact will supersede on the matter of the Parthenon marbles. However, this government, as well as all previous British governments, said that this is not going to happen. Now, the second way is for Greece to accept a loan along the terms of the ones that the British Museum has already given. However, the Greeks said that the loan is not acceptable. And the third way, which I think is very, very interesting, is to use another British law, which is called the Charities Act 2022, that allows museums, despite the fact that they are not charitable institutions, to return artifacts in their collections for which there is an ethical issue. And of course, there are many ethical issues concerning how Britain has acquired the Parthenon marbles. And also, this is a law that some British museums, like the Jesus in Kerbridge and the Horniman in London, intend to use for the return of the Benin bronzes to Nigeria, which means that this law has somehow been tested in this respect. Yet what it seems to be on the table is a cultural strategic partnership on the basis of which the marbles will probably be returned to Athens, and Athens will provide to the museum some temporary rolling exhibitions with important legal antiquities that in fact will be exhibited into the empty Duveen gallery. However, this is what is discussed, but this is not what has been agreed. I want to stress that, which means that agreement is not easy to reach, right? I have negotiated with people from different countries. I can tell you that the British are very difficult negotiators. So for them, even the comma counts. So there are thorny issues, as you have already mentioned. There is the issue of ownership, there is the issue of loan, and there's the issue of the de-alienation of their artifacts from the museum's collection. And these are really thorny issues, and I think that are going to have an agreement very, very soon, to be honest with you.
Niko, you brought up public opinion, and I want to shift us to that dimension of this discussion. Over the past years, British public opinion, as you've stated, has consistently been in favor of the return of the sculptures to Athens. Despite this, the conservatives this week, It took a jab at Starmer tweeting, and I pulled up the tweet here so we could see it. First, he gave away the Chagos Islands. Now he's eyeing up the Elgin Marbles. Keir Starmer loves giving away British assets. Are the Conservatives simply out of touch here? Not just with history, but with the British populace?
There's a significant component of the base of the Tories that will not agree with that. This is something I can confidently say. And this is something related to what I was talking about before. That is relatively new, like a conservative generation of Britons that believe in the sanctity of the monument as an incredible symbol of Western civilization, which they, want to reflect in their politics. They studied, as I said before, in university. So, I think there's part of discourse that has to do with, throwing jabs at each other. The Tories and the Labour Party, they have to do that, right? I mean, the Tories suffered a historic defeat. They need to try to find ways to crawl out of there. But I don't think that this is something that resonates with the majority of the British public. I actually, this week made sure I'm trying to break my echo chamber constantly, right? So I engaged with some of the content of the other side in the UK. So what do the people that really oppose the potential of such a deal say? And it's interesting to see a shift in that they're constantly now focusing on just the legal parts of the argument. They're saying there might just not really be a legal way to do this, or the Greeks are really twisting the way they're trying to say these artifacts, the sculptures were like legitimately taken from Greece, which is one of the arguments that we have in our arsenal, but it's really not what we're discussing right now, right? So I didn't see much even on the other side when it comes to the potential of this partnership, what this would mean for the British Museum. It seems like the arguments are dated, they're fixated just on the legality, and they're not resonating with the British public as much as they used to, right? So yeah, one thing I will say...
Actually, it's funny, given that tweet, that they're talking about legality, because the Chagos Islands, they had to do a deal on that because they lost the case. Yeah. They lost the case. And I'll tell you what, even from natural law or anything, if this was adjudicated, they'd lose this too. All right.
Absolutely.
And and going back to what the professor said, it's a conservative who actually made the most progress on this, George Osborne. And these Tories who are, I get it because these are the same Tories that led their country into the disastrous Brexit, which they have not recovered from. All right. And they want to keep it up. Great. They want to make Britain a more Christian nation. Go back to the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not steal. You stole. Give it back.
Andy, I think
Sunday Times, you cannot say that it is a Labour Party newspaper. Sunday Times, after 50 years, it had its central article saying, give the marbles back to Greece, exactly. In other words. And it is Sunday Times survey in August 2022 that came to the conclusion that 78% of its readers, conservative readers, were in favor of the return of the marbles to Greece.
Yep. Incredible. And I think maybe that this goes to the heart of the argument that Greece is making too now, where you see Mitsotakis, for example, describe this issue in terms of, reuniting a work of art. You talk about, would you dare to cut the Mona Lisa in half? And that might evoke much more of an emotional response than, some of these legal arguments.
And you know what? That's key because Niko brought it up. I think we brush over it. The difference between reunification and return.
Yeah.
The reunification, there, and the professor knows this better, but there are not a lot of these artifacts that you get to see almost in their original home place. And this is, and especially if people want to be legally cute, because I'm a recovering lawyer, the professor is still a lawyer, but law is all about distinguishing cases, not taking a hard and fast rule. And this is one where you can take these, and again, full credit to Greece, by the way, not only for making the case, but full credit for Greece for putting together this amazing museum and every year making it better. Just being able to do that virtual tour on your phone and go through it, being able, and you know which gallery these sculptures would be. And when you visit Greece, and again, tourism has been part of this effort too, because I actually really believe that part of the British change in popular opinion is more tourists went and saw, well, wait a minute, it would be better to see the sculptures right here and be looking at the Parthenon than having them in this sterile place and pretending that we are. It's an old, the people who are fighting this they can use every legal excuse. These are all excuses. They're just hanging on to an idea of colonization. These are stolen. We should reunify, and everybody will win. By the way, the British Museum will win too, because the Greeks, and I'll let the professor talk about it, the Greeks are offering to send stuff that have never been out of Greece to Britain. So if the British Museum want to play this really global role, they should be jumping at this.
Yeah. You're absolutely
is this
right.
really a big opportunity for the museum?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Is this really a big opportunity as well for the British Museum?
Absolutely. And it also sticks perfectly well with Keir Starmer's agenda about, humanistic process, about Britain being more outgoing after Brexit, that in fact has isolated it. So this sticks very well, suits Keir Starmer's agenda. It also suits very much the new profile of the British Museum that they want to renovate, and also gives a unique opportunity to the British Museum to show artifacts that haven't been shown anywhere else. And when you have rolling temporary exhibitions, that creates new audiences. And I think British Museum, as any museum in the world, really needs new audiences.
And Britain in general needs goodwill. This will engender so much goodwill. So much goodwill. And as a way, especially after the disaster that is called Brexit, if Britain wants to rebuild a lot of these bridges with Europe and repair its image to the world, nothing could be. This is one of those where you're watching, and everybody who's watched a sibling or a child do something where you're like, oh my God, why are you doing this? Actually, since I'm in Chicago, this is kind of like us watching the former coach of the Chicago Bears that got fired last week. And you're like, oh my God, what are you doing? What are you doing? You're going to lose the game. The British are finding a way to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. There is something that's not just a victory for Greece. It's a victory for everybody, including the British Museum. And it's really puzzling why we are still where we are.
Endy, your title as we started this was, Lord Elgin's prosecutor. And I'm just curious to see do you think, given how the framing of this question has shifted, from one of ownership to really one of reunification, is it necessary to hash out all of the ethical and the legal questions that have come about from Elgin's removal of these artifacts from the Parthenon? Or is that still a key part of this discussion that we need to focus on?
Well, I'll defer to the professor because this is her expertise, but I think necessarily you're going to get to it because somebody's going to say you're creating a legal precedent. No matter what you do, every judge is going to, and Starmer is, as I discussed before, the Chagos Islands, the Mauritius case, to me, I look at it as a precedent for something in Cyprus. So they're going to be looking at this for precedential value. I think we should be, again, focusing on the fact that this is a unique case in terms of reunification. It's unique. We can list, and I'm sure the professor can, unique elements in this case that would not be applicable, for example, to the Rosetta Stone. But I leave that to the legal experts.
Yeah, Irini, is this how unique of a case is the Parthenon sculptures? I know we've heard from the British and from other museums that this could set a precedent. It could empty our museums if it goes through. How much of that holds water?
Yes, there was an argument on the British side that this will open Pandora's box, which is not so, because Britain has effected returns and Pandora's box did not open. We believe that this is a unique case. That's why Greece, all those years, did not ask back anything else, not even the caryat. It was only asking back only the Parthenon marbles. That was very, very consistent. It never changed. Of course, if something is stolen in the context of international conventions or European law, whatever, of course, we're asking that back and we also take people to the courts. That's clear. Okay, so this is something different. It is a unique case. And now, about ownership. Of course, when Greece said that loan is not an option, you understand that, and we said that loan is not an option because we're the purpose is reunification. So you're gonna take this part, you're gonna stick it together with the rest of the part, and then what? You're gonna break it and give it back? That makes no sense. Loan defeats the purpose. It cannot work. So I guess, I only guess, I'm not saying anything else, that one thing that the British Museum has put on the table is sharing. And I think sharing will be the difficult issue of discussions, to be honest with you. Now, this is one point. The other point, as Endy said, how are you going to argue a case that something is better being apart, being broken, exhibited in different places instead of being reunited? You do not have an argument. Despite that, British Museum came up with a scientific argument in quotation marks. What did they say? They said that the marbles should stay in the British Museum because they say two different stories. They say one story in the Acropolis Museum, the story of the Athenian history, and one story in the British Museum, the story of the world. Read between the lines. The British Museum is better than the Acropolis Museum because it says the story of the world. It doesn't say only the story of Athens. So they say we're a universal museum. And since we are a universal museum, we need to have specimens of different civilizations in order for the visitor to be able to compare between the different civilizations. So what is the role of the Parthenon marbles in the British Museum? To allow the visitor to compare between the Egyptian civilization, the Greek civilization, the Middle East civilizations, and so on and so forth. Of course, this doesn't make this argument scientific in my view. As someone said, the director of another museum, an Indian one, says this argument has its own ideology. In fact, Britain wants to conserve and preserve its own culture heritage and the other people's culture heritage as if it were its own. This does not stand. And we see now the semantics. We see that what Keir Starmer, in fact, an official representing Keir Starmer yesterday, he said that the trustees of the museum need to decide, have in fact the responsibility of the decision for the care and maintenance of the sculptures. The word ownership disappeared. The word loan disappeared. The word universal museum disappeared. This is a huge shift. This shows goodwill. That's why we are confident that at some stage we might reach a decision.
So we can say sharing is caring. There you go.
I wanted to say this. I wanted to use the same quote. And very quickly, what I want to say about this precedent thing in just a few seconds is there already is precedent. We must not forget the Vatican returned parts of the Parthenon sculptures last year. Greece forged an agreement with the Met on other antiquities. Slowly, we have this idea of win-win partnerships everywhere in the world. I am afraid that the Parthenon sculptures, if the British Museum doesn't change course, they will not only be an exception in terms of it being a case of reunification, but an exception in terms of it being a museum that stands idle as the winds of change are making things better across museums everywhere in the world. So I think, the opportunity is there for a win-win situation. It's up to the ball is on the other side of the court, so we'll see whether they take it or not.
I think that's a great place to wrap up. I think we can do one quick round robin since we kicked off with the theme of the heist of the Parthenon. Maybe we can go around and Endy, maybe we kick off with you. Who you would want to be in this heist film if there's one that's made on the Parthenon?
I'd get the original cast from Guns of Navarone and have Anthony Quinn do it.
Niko?
I mean, for vanity purposes, I'd say Brad Pitt, but also he was a great propagandist. So as a journalist, I can package this heist into nice words. So I guess he's the one I would choose.
Well, I'm not familiar with that, so I cannot really answer that question.
It actually should be produced in Trump, since we are coming back in Trump's America, it should be produced by Vince McMahon and have Hulk Hogan break it and just take them. So.
With that, make sure to hit subscribe. Follow us on YouTube, Hellenic American Leadership Council, the Greek Current Cafe, where we do deep dives on these pressing issues. And with that, signing off. Thanks for tuning in, and catch you next week.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.